slowly begin.
Yeah.
Yes, so everyone, we are now live on YouTube. And I think it's about time to begin. So please try to keep your microphones off while the speakers are giving their talks. And do signal that you want to ask questions using the chat so that I know who is coming first and who is second and so on. And if you can say something about the nature of your question, whether it's a follow-up on someone's point or whether it's a new question, even maybe write something about the question, that would make moderation much easier. Since there is a large crew of Leibnizians and friends of Leibniz tonight, I suspect there will be lots of questions. And I forgot one thing I forgot to ask, whether we do questions after each talk or whether we do both talks and we do questions at the end. Alessandro and Osvaldo, how do you prefer?
For me, it's the same. I don't know if Alessandro prefers to have...
It's the same. But perhaps at the end, I would say at the end, perhaps, of both.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
At the end for both. Good. So the talks one after another and question at the end. Let me just say a few words. So the general title of the panel tonight, it's Leibniz on Corporeal Substance and Organism between a priori reasoning and empirical evidence. And the first speaker is Alessandro Becchi with a talk on a metaphysician looking downwards, some remarks on Leibniz and microscopy. Alessandro, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. By here, I mean not at home, but at the seminar, or both. For the sake of brevity and of clarity, I hope, I will read the text and show you some slides. So I try to share my screen. It's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, in a short legal text dating around 1703 on the nature of goodness and justice, Leibniz offers a clear report of his rational theology, showing its effects on the juridical theory. In this context, Leibniz's metaphysical optimism emerges as the claim that God has realized in the actual world the highest possible perfection, despite its apparent disorder. The physical or moral evil, which seems to characterize wide regions of the creation and of our own life, would disappear if we were able to penetrate things in depth and to consider them as a whole, as we do, Leibniz remarks, in looking at insects and other small things in the microscope. This reference to the rising microscopy, far from being a mere rhetorical coloring, introduces a long passage that, in my view, is worth reading in full. Now, nothing corroborates better the incomparable wisdom of God than the structure of the work of nature, particularly the structure which appears when we study them more closely with a microscope. It is for this reason, as well as because of the great light which could be thrown upon bodies for the use of medicine, food, and mechanical ends, that it should be most necessary to push out knowledge further with the aid of microscopes. There are scarcely 10 men in the world who are carefully at work on this, and if there were 100,000, there would be not too many to discover the important wonders of this new world, which makes up the interior of ours, and which is capable of making our knowledge 100,000 times greater than it is. It is for this reason that I have more than once hoped that the great princes might be led to arrange for this and to induce men to work at it. Observatories have been founded for watching the stars, whose structures are spectacular and demand great apparatus. But telescopes are far from being as useful and from revealing the beauties and varieties of knowledge which microscopes reveal. A man in Delft has accomplished wonders at it. And if there were many others like him, our knowledge of physics would be advanced far beyond its present state. It behooves great princes to arrange this for the public welfare, in which they are most interested. And since this matter involves little cost and display, is very easy to direct and needs very little, but good will and attention to accomplish it, there is little reason to neglect it. End of quotation. It's quite significant that a speculative and apologetic text focused on the nature of justice closes with such an enthusiastic appeal to the opportunities opened up by the new observational tool. Such claims are, in my view, an eminent witness of the way in which nascent microscopy has affected various aspects of Leibniz's philosophy and of his own activity as an organizer of knowledge. Repeated references to microscopy are not an exception in the writings of Leibniz. However, in the long passage just quoted, there is an extraordinary convergence of topics which lead us to fully appreciate the different levels on which Leibniz focused his reflection about the discovery of the invisible world. Among these levels, the following are included. 1. The full awareness of the revolutionary import of the new observational tool, both on the cognitive and on the practical one. 2. The idea that the microscope is able to make up penetrate the inside of things, the tiny texture of physical world, revealing us the causes lying behind the phenomena. 3. The prospects opened by microscopy for medicine, food, and industrial goals. 4. The need for an institutionalization of microscopy in order to pass on, share, and implement skills already acquired by individual researchers, such as Antony van Leeuwenhoek, to whom Leibniz implicitly refers in the quoted passage. 5. The idea that the new findings in the microscopic world of life offer an empirical evidence of that ordered variety, which is the hallmark of divine creation. It is noteworthy, at the end of the quoted passage, the polemical dig struck by Leibniz against the astronomical observatories, institutions as much expensive as unnecessary for the public welfare. Leibniz lived in a time in which the telescope, exception made for the discovery of Saturn rings by Christian Huygens, seemed to have exhausted its potential as a means of new findings. As several scholars have pointed out, in the second half of the 17th century, the focus of scientific vanguard shifted from the infinitely large to the infinitely small, from the macrocosm to the microcosm. This reduced scale was quite congenial to Leibniz's forma mentis, which was always extremely attentive to what is small, from physics to mathematics, from historiography to epistemology. In the preface to the new essays, for instance, he remarks that we would fail in philosophy as in politics because we would be neglecting to micron, imperceptible changes. And in a letter addressed to the Electress Sophie, he observes, microscopes show us that the smallest things are enriched with variety in proportion to the great. With regard to the features, or an insensible world revealed by a new instrument, the science historian Edward Rustov has spoken of a new aesthetics, different and in some ways opposed to the aesthetics of astronomy. If the observation of the heavenly bodies generally showed regular movements characterized by mathematical predictability and physical necessity, the new world offered to the astonished eyes of the first microscopists revealed instead a complexity hardly expressible in mathematical terms. Colors and shapes never seen before, unknown living beings characterized by irregular movements and whose behavior was hardly predictable. In one word, a huge variety, whose hidden order was difficult to grasp and describe. Leibniz developed this philosophical system in the historical period in which the first treatises of microscopic anatomy, or Anatomia Subtilis, were published. In the last 3 decades of the 17th century, Robert Hooke, Jan Swammerdam, Marcello Malpighi, and Antony van Leeuwenhoek issued their pioneering works, giving rise to entirely new fields of research. An exchange of letters between Leibniz and Chirnaus, dating at the end of the around 1693, it's quite significant with regard to the perception of the huge cognitive possibilities disclosed by the microscope, which is celebrated as a new Sidereus Nuncius, an instrument that will unfold to our knowledge of nature a much wider field of inquiry for its theoretical and practical consequences than the one inaugurated by Galilei in 1610. As was remarked by Paolo Rossi, while the telescope was introduced within a scientific discipline that in the 17th century was already well structured and which had a long, very long tradition and solid tradition behind, the microscope opened up entirely new fields of research, which gradually gave rise in the following 2 centuries to modern life sciences, from embryology to histology, from cell theory to bacteriology. In the programmatic paper on the project of the foundation of the Royal Academy in Berlin, the microscope is called on to play a leading role within the research activity of the new Prussian Society of the Sciences. In addition to being a fundamental support for the improvement of medicine and chemistry, it reveals to us, says Leibniz, in the sensible world, an insensible one, where the causes of sensible things are often hidden. If it were used in a systematic way by a larger number of people, Leibniz remarks, we would soon get a priceless treasure of knowledge on the inside of nature. The Platonic flavor idea that the microscope allows us to penetrate the insensible side of nature, hiding beyond its phenomena, what Bacon used to call latens schematismus, is already expressed in a sketch for a universal atlas dating back to 1678, where Leibniz notes mundus insensibilis seu de hisque solo microscopio videntur. Also in the discourse on method of certainty and the art of discovering, Leibniz emphasized the huge possibilities disclosed by the microscopes, which show us in the smallest atom a new world of countless creatures, and which help us to know the structure of the bodies that we need. From his youthful writings onward, Leibniz's interest in the discoveries concerning the microscopic world is widely documented. In his letter to Jacob Thomasius, 1669, he makes explicit reference to Robert Hooke's micrographia, according to which iron rust is just a minute forest which has sprung up. And in the same text, recalling Athanasius Kircher's microscopical experiences, he remarks, we know that putrefaction consists in little worms invisible to the naked eye. And an explicit reference to the pioneering observations of such microscopists, Kircher and Hooke, also occurs in a well-known passage of the new physical hypothesis, where the possibility of getting more and more deeper into the subtlest structure of matter is put in connection by Leibniz with the infinite divisibility of the continuum and the fundamental analogy between macrocosm and microcosm. This is the first passage you have here on the slide. And in a well-known text of the February 1676, at the end of the stay in Paris, De Arcanis Sublimium Vel de Summa Rerum, he even seems to argue for the actual infinite division of matter, starting from the remark that every bit of it contains an infinite creatures. I read passage. If it is true that any part of matter, however small, contains an infinity of creatures, that is a word, it follows also that matter is actually divided into an infinity of points. But this is true, provided it is possible, for it increases the multiplicity of existence and the harmony of things or admiration of divine wisdom. In the same text, a proportion is established some line further by Leibniz between the creatures of another world that is infinitely small with respect to us, and another world of infinite magnitude with respect to which we would be ourselves infinitely small. The topic concerning words contained within other words ad infinitum has been already explicitly theorized by my branch in The Search After Truth, but it represents a widespread leitmotif dating back at least to Blaise Pascal and the logic of Port-Royal. Such a topic was, on one hand, strongly intertwined with the emerging mathematical treatment of infinity and the new astronomical discoveries. On the other hand, it was typical of a certain science fiction literature, from Cyrano de Bergerac to Fontenelle, from Francis Godwin to Christian Huygens, authors that Leibniz knows well and quotes several times. It is not a chance that such a topic often occurs in the correspondence between Leibniz and the mathematicians, such as Tschirnaus and particularly Huygens and Bernoulli, where references to the microscopical discoveries are often put in connection with the discussions concerning the nature of infinitesimal quantities. During the Mainz period, Leibniz got into contact with Henry Oldenburg, secretary of the Royal Society, who constantly kept the young learned German up to date on the new scientific publications. Most likely, Leibniz heard for the first time through Oldenburg about Malpighi's De Bombice and Swammerdam Historia Insectorium Generalis, two major treatises on entomology. In such pioneering works, the first systematic dissections of the silkworm and other insects were displayed by astonishing plates, and the stages of their metamorphosis were described in great detail. In Leibniz's view, this seemed to provide an observational basis for the philosophical claim of the animal preformation. In all likelihood, Leibniz first received news about Leeuwenhoek activity during his stay in Paris. Referring to the contents of a letter by Georg Hermann Schuller, which his friend Tschirnaus had shown to him, Leibniz writes down this note: "A craftsman from Delft has improved microscopes to such an extent that it is possible to see even the changes that occur every day in the growth of plants, and to make out the shapes of the denser parts of the air. This is remarkable." As far as I know, this is the first document in which Leibniz makes an implicit reference to Leeuwenhoek. In the November of the same year, 1676, Leibniz made his second trip from Paris to London, where he met Henry Oldenburg, who, knowing about Leibniz's imminent tour in Holland, commissioned him to tell Leeuwenhoek that his long letter addressed to the Royal Society had been received. The paper in question was the well-known letter on the protozoa, subsequently published in the Philosophical Transaction. This letter describes in detail the first astonishing observations of microorganisms, referred to by Leeuwenhoek as animalcula or living atoms. It is possible that Leibniz was able to learn through Oldenburg the contents of the letter even before it was published. From London, Leibniz traveled to Amsterdam, where he met Swammerdam. On this occasion, he may have witnessed some dissections by the highly skilled entomologists and may have visited the rich domestic museum set up by Swammerdam Sr. In Delft, he finally paid a visit to Leeuwenhoek, and a few days later, he wrote Oldenburg an enthusiastic report of this meeting. "I took great delight in Leeuwenhoek's observations, and I wish that many others were moved by the same curiosity, as this would bear great fruit for physics to come. The spectacle of the little worms that pepper and other spices caused to form in water was delightful." Despite the steady interest displayed by Leibniz towards microscopy in general, the figure and the work of the uncultivated Leeuwenhoek, who had received no scientific training at all and could read and write only in Dutch, occupy a special place in his reflections. No other observer had gone so deep into the inside of nature as the Draper of Delft. It is significant that at the end of Leibniz's life, a direct correspondence took place between him and Leeuwenhoek, 40 years after their meeting in Delft. The 5 letters by Leibniz are still unpublished. Among the topics touched on in such an exchange, there are what we nowadays would call biological problems and open questions which, in Leibniz's view, had probably a more general metaphysical import. Among these, why are twins so rare in nature? What happens to those spermatic animals which do not evolve in bigger animals? To what extent can the morphological and functional analogies between plants and animals be pushed forward? Such topics have a clear echo with some major tenets of Leibniz metaphysics: the identity of indiscernibles and related variety of nature, the claim of the unrealized possible, and the law of continuity as applied to the natural world. A special emphasis is also put by Leibniz in this correspondence on the project of establishing in Delft a European school for young microscopists, under the direction of the same Leeuwenhoek. A project doomed to remain unrealized, notwithstanding all the insistence of the German philosopher, and his repeated attempts to accomplish such enterprise. Leeuwenhoek, Swammerdam, and Malpighi constitute in the formative years of Leibniz's philosophical system a sort of triumvirate, to which he frequently refers as the best observers of our time. Through his powerful globular lenses, Leeuwenhoek had discovered countless living beings in the smallest drop of water, suggesting that matter could hardly be conceived as something sterile or passive, as was claimed by the Cartesian tradition. Swammerdam had shown that the smallest insects are really endowed with the same degree of complexity as the larger animals, highlighting in detail the developmental stages of the adult organism from its egg or seed. Meanwhile, through the method of comparative anatomy, Malpighi had reinforced the idea of the fundamental continuity between the animal and the plant kingdoms, and had provided empirical support beyond his real intentions to the doctrine of preformation. The microscopic anatomy of animals and plants, and above all the discovery of the first protozoa, complete living beings characterized by feeling, appetite, activity, and development, gave Leibniz empirical underpinnings for some metaphysical claims that he was working out during the 16th and the 80s. Namely, 1. Matter is inherently organized, that is, organic down to its smallest parts. 2. Every living being has pre-existed in an infinitely small size since the creation of the world. 3. Each soul is always linked to its own organic body, although this body is not always discernible to our senses. 4. The organic body continues to exist in a concentrated form, even after what we call death. 5. The machines of nature, that is, living beings, are endowed with an infinite complexity. 6. The ultimate ground of physical reality is everywhere characterized by life and activity. Discussing in detail each one of these points and providing textual evidence for the impact exerted by early microscopy on the shaping of such metaphysical tenets, or at least on their empirical corroboration, would exceed the limits of this presentation. So I'm going to sketch the conclusion in order to better connect also with Osvaldo's presentation. In relation to the main topic of our panel, I would like to conclude with a final remark about Leibniz's well-known conception of living organisms as divine machines, that is, machines endowed with an infinite complexity. This means that, unlike human artifacts, in the machines of nature, the process of decomposition never reaches simple or elementary machines, that is, machines whose parts are no more than cells machines. Every organ of a living being is in turn composed of other organs, and so on ad infinitum. This conception, I argue, is largely influenced by the observations of animal and plant subtle anatomy. This is quite clear both from Leibniz's repeated references to microscopy in relation to his conception of the organic body, and from the same vocabulary used by Leibniz to describe the physiology of living beings. For instance, the term machinula, tiny machine, which Leibniz uses in a well-known letter to Rudolf Christian Wagner, had a very wide use in the field of the iatromechanics inaugurated by Malpighi. On this point, Gilles Deleuze has effectively observed in his book, The Fold, the mechanisms built by man are not enough machines. The wrong of the mechanism is not that it is so artificial that cannot account for the living, but it is not sufficiently so, that it is not sufficiently machined perhaps. Human artifacts are only pale imitations of those divine machines which are the living bodies. These latter are infinitely more artificial in the sense of the divine artifice than human artifacts. The products of human art are never enough machines in relation to the natural automatons designed by God. Nature is to art as the infinite mind of the supreme engineer is to the finite mind of human craftsmen. The true Baroque machines are the living organisms, characterized by an endless replication of ever smaller machines. It is precisely the character of the infinite complexity of living organisms which, according to Leibniz, guarantees their indestructibility in a purely mechanical way. Destroying a machine that has an infinite complexity implies an infinite process, which is not feasible in a finite span of time, even that of the duration of the whole world. Last slide. In the new system of nature, Leibniz observes that although he is himself the most readily disposed person to do justice to the moderns, he nevertheless believes that they have carried their reform too far, among other things, by confusing natural things with artificial things, because they have lacked a sufficient grand idea of the majesty of nature. The moderns, that is the Cartesians, believe that the difference between natural machines and human artifacts is only between great, and small, that is, a mere difference of degree. Leibniz, on the contrary, is convinced that it is a difference of kind. Even on the classical topic of the relationship between art and nature, Leibniz gives proofs of his intellectual diplomacy. He attempts a reconciliation between the Aristotelian scholastic perspective, which claimed an ontological distinction between the products of art and those of nature, see Aristotle's physics, obviously, and the modern mechanistic conception, which tended to deny exactly this distinction. If for Aristotle, the criterion of the distinction between things that are by nature and those which are for other causes consisted in having or not in themselves the principle of movement and rest, Leibniz insists on the different degree of complexity that characterizes the artificial machines compared to the natural ones. In this jump from a finite complexity, typical of the human artifacts, and an infinite complexity, typical of natural machines, what would seem a mere difference of degree ends up becoming an ontological difference. Insisting on the mechanical character of every natural process, Leibniz strives to inscribe the Aristotelian distinction into the conceptual framework that was at the basis of the new science. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for this paper, Alessandro. As we agreed, we are doing questions at the end. So let's move on now to the next paper. Our next speaker is Osvaldo Ottaviani, and the paper is on Leibniz's late metaphysics and ontology of life, unpublished materials. Osvaldo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. So thank you very much. And just a little warning, this is a kind of work in progress. So I will present some new text, so my conclusions are very tentative. Anyway, so I will focus on the correspondence between Leibniz and Rudolf Christian Wagner. This correspondence mainly involves technical issues, especially the construction of Leibniz's calculating machine. And they used to discuss mainly scientific and technical issue. And for this reason, Leibniz's letter of 4 of June 1710, which dwells only with philosophical question, has been regarded by many as the only remarkable exception in this correspondence. This is not entirely true, actually. Wagner was strongly interested in biology, and he worked on a dissertation of plants, especially on the plants we call bindweed or morning glory. And for this reason, he became involved in a discussion with Leibniz on living beings, especially plants, and his theory of preformation. And there are some letters by Leibniz on the topic of preformation. But in this talk, however, I will mainly focus on this famous letter of June 1710. And first of all, I have to say something about the history of the publication of this text, because it involves a little bit of mystery. Leibniz's letter to Wagner is closely associated to another text, which is commonly known as the Commentatio de Anima Brutorum, Reflections on the Soul of the Beast. And both these texts were published together for the first time in this edition, Leibniz Epistola ad Diversos, edited by Christian Courtauld in 1734. Christian Courtauld just published the text collected by his father, Sebastian Courtauld, who was also a correspondent of Leibniz. And unfortunately, in his preface introducing this text to the reader, it doesn't say too much about the connection between these two texts and their origin. There is just a very quickly reference to the manuscripts, but this is a problem and is part of the mystery, because the manuscripts of both the Commentatio and Leibniz's letter to Wagner seem to be missing from the archives in Hanover. And for this reason, in all the subsequent editions, Dutan, Erdmann, and Gerard, they have been republished following the edition by Courtauld. It's not entirely true, however, that the manuscript of Leibniz's letter to Wagner of June 1710 has been completely lost, because among the texts of the correspondence between Leibniz and Wagner, there is actually one draft of a letter to Wagner dated for June 1710. However, this is not the manuscript of the letter Leibniz sent to Wagner, but it's a first draft of it, a sort of preliminary version, the analysis of which will be the leading thread of this presentation. And this manuscript, for which you can see a particular here, just a small part, has a remarkable peculiarity. In addition to the first draft of Leibniz's letter, it also contains a sort of preliminary study for it, a series of definitions where Leibniz discusses the main philosophical questions he will touch in the letter. Even if they are closely connected, these two texts are distinct. And what follows, I will refer to the draft of the letter as to draft or early letter, and to the other text as to preliminary study. The preliminary study contains a series of definitions and divisions according to Leibniz's well-known method of starting from very general concepts like being, possible, thing, and so on, and then by means of a series of dichotomies or trichotomies going down to always more specific notions. This preliminary study is a rather extraordinary one in the literal sense of the word, because after the initial distinction of beings into substantial beings and accidental beings, substantial beings are then divided into three different species: substantians, substans, and substantiatum. And much of this preliminary study is dominated by the explanation of these three concepts and the cognate questions of the connection between simple substances and bodies as aggregates of substance. And further tripartition proposed in this text is not to be found elsewhere in Leibniz's corpus, as far as I know. The questions discussed there are representative of his philosophical investigation during this stage of his philosophical career. To understand the content of this text, I have to say something very briefly about the context of Leibniz's reply to Wagner. Leibniz defended in this letter the view he expressed in the Ipsa Natura, published in the Acta Eruditorum. In previous letters to Leibniz, Wagner asked Leibniz to suggest him a selection of readings on the question of soul. But in his letter of 3 June, he seems to be dissatisfied with the fact he could not find a proper definition of soul in this text. Then he turned to Leibniz's discussion of soul in the Ipsa Natura, and he tried to summarize his own views. And Wagner objections to Leibniz are summarized by Leibniz himself in the final version of the letter, and this is the first quotation. You said that I adequately defended there the active force of matter, and that when I attribute resistance to matter, I also attribute the reaction to the same thing, and hence also action. And so, since there is a principle of activity everywhere, this principle seems to suffice for the operation of the beasts, and there is no need of an enduring soul in them. The version in the first draft is much shorter, and Leibniz never quotes the question of the soul of the beast, but the two objections are connected, because Wagner's point is that if there is an active principle everywhere in matter, then this could be sufficient to explain all the operations of beasts without ascribing them a soul. The premise of the whole reasoning, however, is the possibility of ascribing activity to matter in cells. And Leibniz, already in the Ipsa Natura, contrasting the idea that matter is essentially passive by distinguishing between primary and secondary matter. Primary matter is passive, and the passage from primary to secondary matter requires the intervention of an active principle, something analogous to a souls. So by briefly saying something about the comparison between, this is the articulation of the final version of the letter, and the first draft just covers the first 4 paragraphs, and so there is nothing corresponding to the last two parts, which will be treated only in the final version of the letter. And coming to this draft, we can say that the draft starts with Leibniz's summary of Wagner objections, then moves to Leibniz's reply to Wagner, where he points out that he never ascribed an active force to primary matter, which is barely passive. Then in the last part, he touches the third point, the definition of soul, introducing the distinction between soul taken in a broad sense and identified with life, with the substance having perception and appetition, this is the broad sense, and soul taken in a narrow sense, the kind of life that involves perception and sensibility. The fourth paragraph of the final version, where Leibniz argues that an organic body has to be added to each vital principle, to each entelechy, with the all exception of God, is not discussed in the draft, but is taken into account in the preliminary study. So the main difference between the two versions of the letter is that in the draft there is this long passage where Leibniz explains his distinction between primary and secondary matter. I will not read it because it's quite long. But this long passage contains at least two philosophically relevant points. First of all, Leibniz introduced distinction between two species of secondary matter or mass. One is the organic body, and the other one is what we call massa rude, raw mass, with the proviso that also raw mass is ultimately resolved into a plurality of organic beings. A stone is full of living things, even though in itself it's not a living thing, and the process goes to infinity because matter is actually divided to infinity. This is the topic already discussed by Alessandro in his presentation. The second relevant point is the explanation of the difference between derivative and primitive forces. Derivative forces, active and passive forces, are just modifications of primitive ones. And being just modifications, they are dependent on primary forces and ultimately on simple substances. This is something Leibniz repeats in a letter to Wolff. But the relevant point here is that this difference is expressed in terms of an opposition between what is perpetual, which is what belongs to primary forces, and what is just transitory, what belongs to derivative forces, and the corresponding connection with the distinction between what is substantial and what is accidental. As Leibniz says, substantia manet qualitas mutatur. And this point is repeated and echoed in the preliminary study where Leibniz writes, and then this second quotation in this page, in every living thing, the substance is conceived of just as that which I understand in me when I say I, or even if the mass of my body is in a continuous flux, so that probably when I'm old, I retain nothing of the mass I received when I was born, nonetheless, I do remain the same, and the same holds in the case of all living, sensing, and ratiocinating beings, so that they persist even though their mass flows. These remarks shows us, Richard Arthur has pointed out in his last book, that a substantial form is, first of all, a diachronic unity, something which provides a thread to the, I'm quoting Arthur, a thread through the various material manifestation of the substance through time, which differ at every moment. And so each monad is a principle of unity of a living being in the sense that what makes possible that the thing remains the same through all the changes undergone by its body, also because for Leibniz, no living thing retains precisely the same body for more than a moment. And indeed, in the final version of the letter, Leibniz will refer to Theseus' ship to express the relationship between the machine of the body and the primitive entelechy. So, skipping to the other part of this manuscript, what they call the preliminary study, we can see how Leibniz's reflections on living beings led him to discuss more complicated and difficult ontological questions concerning the nature of substance, bodies, composition, and so on. In the draft, there is a cancelled passage in which he wrote what you can find in the first quotation. I distinguish between substance, substantial, and substantiated. Substantiatum. Substance is a complete being endowed with a simple primitive entelechy, and a being of this kind is not only God, but also every living thing. There are other tests in which this distinction between substance and substantiated is presented. I quoted some here. Sorry, but generally speaking, this distinction is articulated by Leibniz in his late philosophy. However, the peculiarity of this preliminary study for Wagner is that in this case, Leibniz introduces for the first time a tripartition between three terms. So substantians, which I don't know how to translate into English, so I left it in Latin, substantia and substantiatum. And this is the first quotation in this slide. Every being, hence, is either a thing or a mode. A thing is a substantial being, a mode an accidental being. I distinguish substantial being into substantians, substance, and substantiatum. And above this line, Leibniz add principle and into principle and principiatum. Substantians and substance are a simple thing. Substantiatum is a composite thing. Substantias is incomplete, at least in creature. Substantiatum can be referred to both complete and incomplete things. Here, Leibniz adds a tripartition within the domain of the substantial, instead of the typical bipartition between substance and substantiated we meet in other texts of this period. The substantians shares simplicity with the substance in contraposition to the substantiatum. Sorry. But on the other hand, the difference between the substantians and the substance is that the former is incomplete, while the latter is a complete thing, or at least this holds in the case of created things, and this is very important, and I will come back to this in a moment. The substantial is presented as a substantial principle itself and is either active or passive. And from what Leibniz adds on the above the line, we can work that substance and substantiatum are principiata, whereas substantians is a principium. And under the general category of substantians, Leibniz understands primitive forces, and so primitive active and primitive passive force. And this is the second quotation. The active substantial principle is usually called substantial form by the school, and primary entelechy by Aristotle. I usually call it also life, and sometimes soul. Mind is also a species of this principle. Nonetheless, sometimes life, soul, and mind are taken in such a way as to designate the monad itself, that is the ego. The passive substantial principle or primitive passive power is antitypy, impenetrability, which consists in natural impenetrability, and it makes possible that one thing be outside the other and can be distinguished from the other. So one problematic point here is that Leibniz says that sometimes life, soul, and mind, so the primitive active principle, is used to designate the monad, like in the case of the ego. A few lines below, however, monad is equated with a complete substance, or at least with substance is something simple and complete. Simple because it cannot be resolved into a plurality of agents, complete because it is sufficient for active. And then you come back with the association with the ego. In every living thing, the substance is conceived of just as that which I understand in me when I say I. So we have a kind of ambiguity in this passage, in this very same text. So on one hand, monad is associated with the active substantial principle, so with an incomplete principle, and on the other hand, monad is associated to simple and complete substance. This duplicity is well known to Leibniz scholars, and I've quoted two quite famous texts, one letter to Birling, which in the parentheses you can find that's no, so there is a mistake here. In the first one is not soul, is a monad or some. So sorry, no, it's okay, it's okay. Is a monad, i.e., a soul or something analogous to a soul. And in a famous letter to Bernoulli, monad is associated with the animal. So what is complete and is, consists of both the active and the passive. So this ambiguity has been already noted and discussed and produced a lot of debate among the scholars. Arthur recently remarked that a similar twofold way of identifying substances with forms on one end and composite on the other was already present in Aristotle. In this way, he suggests that corporeal substances are not in conflict with the thesis that things can be resolved into monads or simple substances alone. I just want to point out that the apparent oversight in the passage can be made sense of if we take into account the reason why in this particular text Leibniz chooses to introduce a third term, the substantians, in addition to substances and substantiated things. I will skip some parts. I will skip this because I don't have too much time. So there is this passage on incomplete substantiatum, which I can skip. And so what I would like to suggest is that the kind of problem Leibniz is trying to tackle here concerning the possibility concerns the possibility of ascribing the same notion of substance or substantiality to both created substances and infinite or uncreated substances, which is God. In the passage quoted above, Leibniz remarked that the substantians is incomplete, at least in creatures, saltem in creaturis. Creatures, created monads, are a mixture of activity and passivity, activity limited by a degree of passivity, whereas God is pure activity with no passivity at all. And the same mixture is mentioned in a text concerning temporal change and is quoted in this slide from De Mutationibus. And the abstract thing that constitutes myself and distinguishes me from any other is the substantial form, and it cannot be taken away from its subject. Hence, it might be doubted where there are really two incomplete beings here, the subject and the substantial form inhering in it. Since a principle allowing to demonstrate this point cannot be found clearly, we can nonetheless conceive two things, a principle of passion, as it were a subject, and a principle of action, as it were a form. This polarity between the subject on one end and the substantial form mirrors the polarity between the passivity and activity at work within every created substance. But the main problem here is that also God counts as a substance, is the primary monad for Leibniz. And in this case, the active-passive polarity seems to break down because in God there is no passivity. The question is taken into account by Leibniz in a series of metaphysical definitions, which should have been written more or less in this period. I've quoted two of them here, but I will read just the second one. Leibniz say the concrete, according to the schoolman, is either incomplete or complete. Incomplete is like the bare subject itself without taking into account any activity or form. Such an abstraction cannot take place in God with pure activity. In the creature, it is the principle of passion, and in corporeal things, it is called primary matter. And if we go back to the preliminary study for Wagner, the same topic, we can see that the same topic is introduced when Leibniz discussion the distinction between finite and infinite substance, and I'm reading. The infinite substance is God, in which there is no passive power, and it's neither the case that it resists other things or that other things resists it. Rather, in God, there is just the entelechy alone, even though this does not mean that he is a less complete being. Therefore, only God is pure act, and since all things flow from him, he can be distinguished from the other things not in terms of space and figures, but in terms of a kind of primitive nature itself. For even though all forces or powers are primitive with respect to the subject in which they inhere, absolutely speaking, however, they are whole derivative. Hence, it is also the case that God is not endowed with a body. So in this text, God as pure activity or pure positivity is often contraposed to creatures which are only a mix of positivity and imperfection, or activity and passivity. In our text, Leibniz stresses that only God is pure activity, pure act, pure entelechy, even though this does not mean that is a less complete being. So we must distinguish between two senses of completeness. The first one to be understood in terms of the form and matter composition, and the second one, the kind of completeness without composition, we can ascribe to God as well. And if you remember well, in the previous part of this text, Leibniz introduces completeness as what is sufficient for acting, completum qui ad agendum sufficit, which is a characterization that fits very well with the idea of God as pure activity. So, taking God into account presses Leibniz to rearrange his distinction between primary and derivative natures. In the domain of created things, primitive nature are substances and derivative natures are accidents or modification of the primitive. However, when taking God into account, also substances with their primitive natures must be regarded as derivative. So from a different point of view. The difficulty here, if I'm not mistaken, consists in expressing both the dependence of all created substances on God and at the same time their ontological autonomy. So the creatures, so Leibniz says, not part of God, not modification. The dependence on God has to be understood in terms of a kind of primitive nature. From the point of view of the subject of inherence, all powers and forces are primitive, but from another point of view, absolutely speaking, they are whole derivative ones. And this point is repeated in the last lines of this other quotation. I will not read entirely, but I will just focus on the last lines. Is a substance is also primitive or derivative. The former is like the ego, the latter like a man. Also, the substantial is either primitive or derivative. In another sense, however, the primitive substance is God, the derivative one is the creature, and this sense I prefer. This is just a marginal annotation and it constitutes a later addition to another table of definitions. But it looks very close to the reflection we find in the preliminary study for Wagner. Also, in this case, there is this ambiguity in the uses of primitive and derivative, and the distinction between primitive and derivative substance is taken as twofold. In one sense, it refers to the distinction between a pure monad and the composite of substantial form and matter. In another sense, the primitive substances is only God, and this is what Leibniz seems to prefer. And I will go to conclude my talk with last quotations. So in another series of definitions, Leibniz proposed the following division. Sorry. He says, every substance is active, but a difference arises here. One substance is only active, that is pure entelechy or pure act, and this is God. Another is both active and passive, and this is called creature. And the latter is either immaterial, not having resistance, or material, having resistance. However, Leibniz immediately adds that all created substances are endowed with matter, as in the case of the angels, who have a very subtle body. But substantia materialis, Leibniz says, if it is a true substance, a truly one, will consist of an entelechy and a passive principle, which contains a resistance, and is called material. And immediately below, he adds that every material substance is endowed with vital principles, perception, appetite, and so on. And therefore, it always has an organic body corresponding congruence to the vital activities. So from a very conceptual point of view, Leibniz seems to accept that there can be created substances which, however, are purely immaterial. But what he says in the last part of this text blocks this possibility, leading to the conclusion that, as a matter of fact, every created substance, even angels, is a material one in the sense of having an organic body. The distinction, however, is an important one, for it resembles what Leibniz said to the boss in 1606, when he explained that primary matter is part of the essence of a created substance. And this means that by means of a miracle, God could, in principle, deprive a created substance of its secondary matter, but it would be impossible even for God to deprive created substance of its primary matter, for, I'm quoting, for he would thus make it a pure act, and such as he alone is. So, and this is my very last my conclusion. That said, it would be tempting to find a connection between this and Leibniz's claim about the natural exigency that every created substance has a material counterpart, so to say, which is the organic body, that it reflects and represents within itself, especially because the presence of an organic body, according to Leibniz himself, is what constitutes the particular point of view of every created substance. To Lady Masham, Leibniz replies that the nature of a simple substance does not consist of extension, but I'm quoting, it is related to the extension it represents. Therefore, one has to place the soul in the body, where there is its point of view according to which it represents the universe to itself. And to Birling, Leibniz writes, quoting, every created monad is endowed with an organic body, in accordance with which it has perceptions and appetitions. End of the quotation. Monadic perception and appetition and universal animation are just two sides of the same coin for Leibniz. And once again, but I won't read it, this is, you can read it in this is a cancelled part from the draft to Wagner, in which, in some sense, he derives the claim that everything is organic, everything is animated in the world from his theory of monadic perception. So I finish here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you both for keeping such a good timing with your talk. So now we have plenty of time for questions. Just a reminder, please do write in the chat either your question or whether you want to follow up a particular point. So signal yourself in the chat for questions.
Okay, so
we already have people willing to intervene. So I will call upon Richard Arthur to give us his comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, both of you. Enjoyed both of the talks. I have a comment on yours, Osvaldo, on this idea that that Leibniz expresses there, that all forces or powers are primitive with respect to the subject in which they inhere, but absolutely they could be regarded as derivative. And it seems that that connects up very well with his views that we've seen in the long paper we're translating on the Scientia Infinita, because the idea there would be that the absolutely absolute, which is God, is an infinite and unlimited, completely unlimited, whereas and unlimited in all aspects, so omnipotent, etc., etc. So force in a finite creature is a limitation of divine omnipotence. right? So it's derivative in that sense because it is, in a sense, a modification, a limitation of the infinite, of omnipotence. And then again, you've got the derivative forces, a derivative of the primitive forces, in that they're instantaneous modifications or momentaneous modifications. So it seems that that makes sense with Leibniz's deeper Neoplatonic ontology.
Yes, I completely agree. I had the intention of quoting a passage from our text, but then there was no time. So one has always to make choices, unfortunately. But yes, I agree. There is also, this is why also I made reference perhaps too quick to pure positivity, because, okay, when Leibniz looked at this topic from the point of view of his theodicy, he used pure positivity, and so privation and negation. And when he talks of the original limitation of essential limitation of creatures, and in this other text he used a more metaphysical, also physical, the terminology, talking about pure activity, pure act, and passivity. But there is a connection also, because when talking of metaphysical evil, so limitation, he refers to natural inertia, and he also speaks of matter in the sense. So I think in Leibniz's mind there is a kind of connection between these different aspects of. And of course, I agree also in this text there is not the idea that creatures flow from God, this kind of Neoplatonic framework is present, perhaps just in the background, but it's always there. So I absolutely agree with your remark. Thanks.
Dan.
Thank you very much, both speakers. And I have what I think are straightforward but very difficult questions for both. For Alessandro, I think you showed very nicely Leibniz's continuing interest in the work of the microscopists, period. But I think at one point you did say that you thought that Leibniz's view, his sort of pan-organism, the idea that everywhere in nature, to infinity, there are organic bodies with souls. And I think you represented this as being derived from his interest in the microscopists. I'm wondering whether it was derived from it or just simply supported by it. I think that one can give an account of how Leibniz came to that position, independently of what it is that was going on empirically with the microscopists. But there's no question that he thought that the discoveries that were going on in Leeuwenhoek and Swammerdam and so on strongly supported the metaphysical view of the world that he had already found. Osvaldo, I'm wondering if you could say something, and you talked about the idea that every monad has both matter and form, which is to say activity and passivity, and that matter is interpreted as an organic body. In the later period, how do you think Leibniz understood this organic body?
This is a very difficult question.
Exactly why I asked it. Because I think it's in a certain sense one of the key puzzles.
Yeah. So who starts, Alessandro or?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So many thanks for your question and observation. So I didn't want to give a reductionist picture of Leibniz, obviously, of Leibniz conception of monads as animals. He also write something like this to Bernoulli and so Osvaldo. But I don't want to say that a rationalist like Leibniz build up starting from experience or observation, but that he uses carefully, uses sharply recent discoveries in order to support what he probably had shaped independently of the rising of the microscope. But here there is also some pre-established harmony. So exactly in the period in which Leibniz tries to shape this unorthodox atomism, this vitalist atomism, it is also the golden age of microscopy. And I think this can have a certain significance in our way to conceive classical historiographic or epistemological labels such as rationalism. So I don't know if I answered a little bit.
No, I think so. I think you can find in some of Leibniz's earliest physics, for example, the Theoria Modus Concreti of 1671. You can already see the that everything is divided to infinity.
Yes,
which is a basic commitment.
Yes.
Well, commitment goes a little bit back and forth on it, but plus it's something that you can find from very, very early. But I was delighted to find Hook and Swammerdam actually empirically finding something. Well, they of course didn't see to infinity, but their observations certainly did suggest a confirmation for what he had.
I agree. I perfectly agree. But it's not a chance that in key passages in which Leibniz shapes, so to say, his mature philosophical system from the correspondence with our know on, he makes references ad hoc to observation. Perhaps, and then I close here. Perhaps the most interesting question is how experiment and a priori reasoning are connected with each other. If I'm not wrong, in the commentary of the monadology by Émile Bottrou, there is some page about the pre-established harmony between a priori and a posteriori reasoning. It is also part of Leibniz.
I think so. I mean, he is certainly interested in the empirical world, but it certainly has got to be understood in a certain sense through a priori principles.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
So, okay, so the premise is that your question is very difficult, and so I will not provide a satisfying answer. I will try to say something. One thing is that in these late texts, at least those which I studied, so there is this account of substantiatum, which is an aggregate of substances. In his notes on his copy of Berkeley's treatise, Leibniz says that matter is not just an appearance, it is not a substance either, but is the resultatum substantiarum, what results. And so this one big question is that resultare, we know that resultare is a kind of dependence, ontological dependence, but I mean, it's not easy to sketch exactly what Leibniz means. But another interesting point, which I put in my presentation that I had to skip it, is that in this text, Leibniz seems to, he also said now that there are not just the substantiatum as a collection of substances, but he wants to find a place for the idea of the collection of a collection of entelechies. So there is a kind of what in the text to Wagner, he said there is an incomplete passive substantiatum, which are the primary matter of all substances taken together. There is a formal active substantiatum, which is the collection of all the entelechies. And so he seems to find a place for, or he wants to find a place for, I don't know, the form of the body or the form of the corporeal substance. And this topic is developed in several late studies. One is this text connected with the correspondence with the boss, which has been translated by Brandon Luke in one of the issues of Studia Leibniziana. But also in that case, Leibniz is, as usual, alternative, either just phenomena and monads or something more, just to be added. And in that text, he also says, in order to have not just a composite, but a suppositum, so to make something which is, in a sense, more close to something substantial. And so from what I say, Leibniz has not a clear and definitive answer to this problem. But what is sure is that the organic body is necessary because, as he repeats in many texts, the place of the monad and so also the position of the monad within the order of the universe is given by the reference to the organic body. He says that in the metaphysical consequence of the principles of reason, which is another of these texts, important text of this period, he says something similar to that, so that in a sense of reference to a body is necessary to have an ordering, so orders between substances, and it explicitly talks of a relationship of space and time and causal relations and so on. So of course, this is a big problem. What about the nature of the body, and if also the discussion with the boss? It's very, very complicated. But one important thing is that this reference to an organic body seems to be necessary for the very same framework of Leibniz philosophy.
No, I think so. It goes back fairly earlier. You can see in the correspondence with Arnaud,
Yeah,
in the Système Nouveau, that the idea that there is always a body together with the soul.
but what is striking, at least to me, is that in these late texts, Leibniz makes several attempts, and he seems to be dissatisfied also with the terminology. So he invents a lot of new terms, like just a very short list. He uses, as I said, substantia, substantiatum, monadatum, substantia ortiva, and substantia originalis, in order to distinguish between originalis is monad, ortiva is a man or living being. He uses substantia accreta from accresco and so on. So also this kind of richness of different terminology perhaps is a sign that he was struggling for.
I think so. My own view is there is certainly some constants. There's certainly some commitments that he's got, but he is struggling to work out the details.
And there is also the other, which is perhaps the easiest way, what they say to Tournemine, which is also repeated in other texts, where he says that what I can explain philosophically is just what concerns phenomena, then there must be metaphysical union, which is something else. And it's interesting because in a text, in another text, he connects this point of the metaphysical union with the incarnation of God. Yep. So it seems to refer to something which is not completely explainable in natural terms. So as far as I can see, there are different options in Leibniz's mind, and
I think he's figuring out.
yeah, he's trying to figuring out, or perhaps he also, it's also typical of Leibniz to have different options and to work with different hypotheses at the same time and trying to use the one which, so this is my attempt to reply.
Well, thank you. That pretty much agrees with my feelings about what's going on there. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next question. We have a list of questions already. So next is Karin Verelst.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces. I hope you are all well. Yes, Arthur, I was thinking of you too. And of course, Dana and Dan and blah, blah. I have a small question, not a small question, but a short question for, I think, Alessandro, the first speaker. Is that correct? Both were very interesting presentations, by the way, but there are so many people wanting to ask questions, so I will not be too egoistic. I was completely, it's because it relates directly to my proper interests. I was completely fascinated by the quote you gave on the I as a fundamental ontological point of reference for both continuity and identity. There was a quote somewhere in your slides where you refer to this. I forgot even from which manuscript it came.
Sorry, the reference. Should I show you one slide again?
You gave a quote from Leibniz where he uses reference to the I, the ego.
No, perhaps it was Osvaldo. Perhaps it was the second presentation. It was Osvaldo.
Oh, excuse me.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
Sorry. Well,
no problem.
Which simply proves that you both brought
the slide with the ego.
Yes, that's the one. Okay, Osvaldo, sorry, it's to you that I address my question then. So can you bring up this quote once again, please?
Yes, one moment, just time to sharing the screen once again. So there are several ones with the ego, so let's try to see which
That's
one.
the one, yes. Oh, no, the former one.
No, this not this one.
You had it. Not that one, not that one. Not that one.
Here there is a reference. So
not
before,
that one. No, not that one. Not that one. That's the one. That's it.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. This is really an absolutely fascinating quote, and I would like to know more because, of course, the first idea that would spring in people's mind is that this is somehow linked to Cartesian approach, but what I like about this is that it is really much more related to the medieval idea of the nunc stans, because here actually to have a kind of absolute reference point, which is at the same time moving through the continuity, and at the moment here and now guaranteeing complete and absolute identity is a kind of paradoxical entity or instantiation, if you want. And I would just like to know if there is more material from Leibniz himself about this, where he clarifies potentially what his sources are with respect to this and what his own elaboration of this I actually is.
Yes, just one moment to come back to. Okay, yes, the two reference I put there, one is Richard Arthur's book and the other is this paper by Stefano Di Bella. Both are connected, so they are much more
yes, but
and yes, the I, the ego, is the typical example Leibniz made when they say, so someone say, can you show me the example of a true substance?
Yes,
and there's kind of reference to the introspection. So the I, the ego, is the example of a typical example of the substance. But yes, there is also this idea of that something which remains the same through time, and
course, yeah.
the topic of temporal change is.
I asked this because, of course, this goes back not only on medieval philosophy, but directly to pre-Socratic problematics, pre-Socratic topics, yeah, which go through the whole philosophical tradition and pop up regularly in different disguises. I only know Leibniz's work with respect to his dynamics. I'm not so much into these aspects of his work. So I was surprised, and I'm just curious to know whether he references his own sources for this concept, for this notion of I, not just as a psychological, but also as an ontological instance, if you want, or yeah, substance, whatever. But then we become circular, of course. But as an ontological datum, if you want, that at the same time references to movement through continuity, and at the other hand, towards identity. I'm just curious to know whether there is more explicit material on this.
I don't know exactly about in this moment. Some texts about the sources of this topic. I don't know exactly. One of the texts quoted this very interesting text, De Mutationibus, on change. Interesting because, as Stefano Di Bella showed, is related to the Leibniz reading of Locke. So the topic of temporal personal identity debated in Locke.
Yes.
But in that place, Leibniz refers to two ancient opinions, so we call the Democritians, who deny in some sense the transtemporal, and the Aristotelian, and he compares these two views. So there is a reference to, at least not a precise reference to, but it's kind of.
Oh, that's interesting.
But if other aspects of this thing come to my mind, I can write you and then just.
Oh, that would be very kind. Yes.
And of course, the others, Rick Arthur and Stefano, are much better.
Yeah.
Equipped than me to reply to this.
Yeah, yes, but I have to check the context of what they do with this quote, of course. Thank you very much. In any case.
I think next is Vincenzo De Risi.
So thank you very much, Osvaldo, and I'm very much interested in the text that you are transcribing and working on. I'm very much looking forward to see them published at some point. And I have a question on those texts, in fact, and in particular on a couple of passages that you have quoted, in which Leibniz discusses these concrete and yet incomplete beings. I mention them because they are a very famous difficulty for an appreciation of Leibniz philosophy of mathematics. One of the most important difficulties with Leibniz philosophy of mathematics is that he consistently says that mathematics is about abstract things and that mathematical objects are abstract. And then there is one single text already published by the Academy in which Leibniz says, however, that he seems to present a more complex discussion rather than concrete versus abstract. And he says that there are concrete and yet incomplete beings, and those concrete, incomplete beings are in fact the mathematical objects and space and time themselves. Now, this is quite isolated. So there is a debate in Leibniz studies on the philosophy of mathematics on whether Leibniz conceived the mathematical objects as abstract or rather as concrete and yet incomplete, as in that passage there. Now, you show a second passage in which Leibniz discusses the question of concrete and yet incomplete beings. And this may be just the second reference that we have. But in this passage that you quote, these concrete and incomplete beings is the primary matter, or the antitype, or that is something that may have relation with space after all, because in another passage you mentioned, he says that antitype is what allows to be external to one another of things. So my question is whether
Thank you very much. No, in relation to what you say, if I remember well, but it's based on my memory, so it could be in one of these series of definition that will be published for the 6.5 being prepared in Münster, he also talks of the concretum mathematicum in one of these texts. And it seems to refer also to space, time. So, and the concretum mathematicum is not complete in the sense of the individual. So there should be some passages in which this topic resurfaces in some sense. So if you want, I can just send you my unofficial version of this text. And
yes, of course.
Okay, yeah. And there should be because at some point Leibniz writes long series of definitions, all based on this distinction, all start with this distinction between the concrete and the abstract, where both logical and question. So there is a kind of mixing of ontological issues and also now the distinction between terms and the rest. So the distinction between the conceptual but there are also ontological reflection that touches your topic. So they are very complex texts, but there are also reflections that go in the direction you pointed out. So perhaps you can find something that could help you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I see that Philip Sloan has a hand up, so maybe you want to go next.
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, this was a very interesting pair of papers. I think particularly the interplay between what we would call a discussion of microscopy and a discussion more of the metaphysical issues. But my question is really reading it from another direction of people, how they misread some of this discussion, and particularly in Leibniz. And maybe this question particularly goes to Osvaldo on this point, because it seems from my own readings, particularly in, say, the middle of the 18th century, they lose the distinction that Leibniz would be making from their readings of Leibniz through Wolff and Du Châtelet. They lose the distinction between substance and matter, and so that the objects being seen by the microscope are in fact the monads themselves, and that this is really the basis of what we might call a vital materialism that is developing. We see in Diderot, La Métrie, and others, and Buffon is also his notion of organic molecules. The question I would have is, how do you see the distinction? Could you just briefly summarize again between substance and empirical matter? Because I think that's the thing that gets conflated in these later discussions. I wonder if you could clarify that a little bit more.
This is the series of very difficult questions. Okay.
And I think it's difficult. I think because of the difficulties, why they hardly got it confused.
Yeah, no, what you say, so about the early reception of Leibniz, as far as I know, is correct. They misinterpreted Leibniz and this kind of physical monadologies.
Yeah, that's right.
There are some partial exceptions. For instance, Kästner, in his preface to when the new essays are published in 1675, there is a preface by Kästner, and Kästner objects to both the Wolffians and the anti-Wolffian. If you use big powerful telescopies or microscopies, you will never reach monad in some sense. Yeah. Never, if I remember it well. So, but was not the And of course, all the controversy between monadists and anti-monadists was based on this kind of confusion. And yeah, of course, matter. Yeah, matter. Of course, it's not substantial in itself. First of all, so this is the main disagreement also with the Cartesians, and because extension, but also matter is something depending on something more fundamental.
Okay,
so,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Of course, the big problem is how to interpret this now the nature of matter. So the big question is that if Leibniz is not, in some sense, not rejecting at all the reality of matter, and this is false, I think, because, for instance, when he reads Berkeley, he says, no, this is too much. No, he likes paradoxes because you should not deny matter. You have just to say that matter is not substantial. So matter is not substantium, but is something which results from substances. Of course, so perhaps one reason for those who read Leibniz immediately after his death was that, first of all, in the text available at the time, this question was not touched or perhaps left in the background, so it was not very easy to understand Leibniz's point, perhaps. But there is also to say that it was objectively difficult to understand exactly what Leibniz had in mind when grounding matter on a simple substance. Of course, the best way to abandon the immaterialistic view is to ground his theory of matter in its dynamics. So in that case, with forces.
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, sure.
Of course, we have something which is, it is not just so kind of idealistic stuff, but it's something which is grounded on something effective. And in this kind of the dynamic foundation of matter, perhaps is Leibniz's key to. But so from the ontological point of view, it's clear that it distinguishes between true substantiality, so substance, and matter. Matter in itself, so consider abstractly, or like in the Cartesian matter extension, is not substance, first of all, and it's just an abstract concept, and as something which need to be grounded on something more fundamental in this sense. But this does not mean a reductionist account of matter. So
just one footnote that maybe bears on Alessandro's important discussion, because when Leibniz was looking through the microscope with Leeuwenhoek at microorganisms and so forth, did he think he was looking at material structures or substances, or did he really make such discussions? I'd be interested to know if he made any comments to that effect.
Well,
because this is this would be the point where his subsequent interpreters say, look, when you're looking at monads or microorganisms, you're looking at the monads, and those monads are material, and those are vital pieces of matter.
Well, it's difficult. I believe that when Leibniz, as it seems from the sources, from what he writes in letters and so on, reports, looked through the microscope, some letters to don't remember, he reports to have built himself globular lens microscopes also, and they give a receipt in order to build by oneself at home microscopes and so on. So he seems to have some direct experience, notwithstanding his short sighting with looking. But I think that when he looks through a microscopes, he doesn't look as a fine metaphysicians. he looks through the microscope as a natural philosopher, as everyone who discovered that the scale of living beings doesn't stop where we thought it stopped. So there is an infinity of living creatures, so to say, downstairs as upstairs. But I think this can have a relevance for the topic discussed by Osvaldo, for example, of the Leibniz classical claim about the necessity of this link between every creature and an organic body. I mean that first protozoa, so to say, the animalcula, I think they were, in Leibniz view and for Leibniz mindset, good candidates for a sort of things, a sort of metaphysical things, good candidates for preformation of the body, good candidates for the body linked to every monad, good candidates for the idea that after death the body contracts and doesn't disappear. On this point, I would briefly make a hint to the distinction discussed by Osvaldo about Wagner, about Leibniz letters to Wagner or draft, the distinction between bare and clothed matter. Perhaps this is a fancy, but it comes to my mind a theatrical image, a theatrical metaphor employed by Leibniz in some passages about the mask of Harlequin, which is on the stage, which has many clothes, so clothed matter, so to say, with an active print, and it cannot be stripped off, because under one clothes you has always another clothes. So perhaps this is only a coincidence or a lexical clue, but microorganisms are also good candidates for the stage before birth and after death. And so monadology starts by saying that monads cannot rise nor be destroyed mechanically, but only God can annihilate monads, and the body connected to the monads. So I think this, I don't know if I answered in some sense.
No, I mean, I think it's been an interesting.
Sorry for my English. My oral English is awful.
Yeah, no, that's very good. That's a very good point. Yeah.
But I have a question for Osvaldo, if it's possible. I have a question for Osvaldo. In one of your last slides, perhaps the not the last one, but the other, when we talk about angels, and Leibniz talks always often about angels, no, this hierarchy. In the definition you have discussed, one point has struck me. So the angels are put in the category of immaterial creatures, and as immaterial they have not resistance, okay, but they have subtle bodies. They are endowed with subtle bodies. So I ask, so angels' bodies have no resistance at all?
That's a good question. I should check this. Leibniz sometimes has strange theories about the body of the angels. So the general framework is that only God is without body, so also angels or Genie, as sometimes you say, have a kind of body, but this body is different, of course, from our body. Sometimes there is a very subtle body, and yes, perhaps one of the things is, so there are different passages in which it speaks about angels and this question of the body of the angels. In the draft to Wagner, he says something very strange. Says that angel can abandon their body in some sense, which, I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but the Latin sense of the sense of the Latin is that they can leave or abandon their own body. So they can. So of course they have a body, but yes, in a sense their body is different from. So in this sense, they also perhaps can have a body which has not resistance in some sense. So this could be a good point also for the distinction between
He likens them to flames. Okay, sorry.
Without the microphone.
It's Daniel Cook. Did you want to say something? Oh, you are muted.
You have to.
Wanted to say that he quotes the Old Testament about a flaming. He likens the angels to flame. That's his most common physical or material way of describing it. And there's a passage about flaming something to the Lord. I forget where in the Bible, but I think that's the most concrete example he gives of the kind of body or that angels have. Excuse me, sorry.
No. Yes, but this is, I mean, Alessandro, your question was a good one, so I have to check carefully what Leibniz says about the body of the angels of these creatures.
But meanwhile,
just a very quick follow-up. The reference to Arlequin is also in the letter to Wagner in the final version. So
in the final,
this connection with the cloth is, I think it's a good point.
It's connected with the mechanical indestructibility of body.
Yeah, the point is that you can never destruct. So the organism is not mechanically generable and cannot be destroyed.
And one machinula persists always. One machinula uses this term.
Yeah, of course.
Right, since there is not much time left, I kind of try to make a selection here. Osvaldo, there is a question written in the chat by Daniel Anderson, but Daniel left, so maybe you can.
Okay, I will read it
later.
Yes.
I will ask Dan Garber to intervene because he has an answer, not the question. So then.
Right. Philip Sloan asked about when Leibniz was looking through the microscope, what was he seeing? Matter or substances? He was seeing corporeal substances.
Yeah.
Quite clear. There's a
I agree.
Discussion. It comes up in the discussion of microscopy in the Letters with Arnaud.
Okay.
Where he's relating what it is that is seen through the microscope to his theory of corporeal substances, which involve, and a corporeal substance is an organic body together with a soul.
Okay. Okay.
So you can find that there.
Yeah. Good. That's a good reference. Yeah. Very good. But that would not make him. I think the problem that comes up later is that making him into a vital materialist, which he's not. I don't think.
No, not exactly.
That's the jump. Yeah.
Right.
Corporeal substance is not vital piece of matter. Yes.
No, but it's a vital substance.
That's true. Vital substance.
Constituents of the world.
Yes.
Right. Eric Bristol.
Daniela, I see a long question from Dennis Dacci about
Please jump in first, would you?
Yes.
in the chat.
Let me jump in first. I just have a
Oops,
comment.
I have a problem now.
Yes,
with the-
do you see in the chat the question from Dennis Dacci?
Yeah, but let me go in first, would you? Because she already.
Okay.
I think Donna has a technical issue. So yes, go first.
So I'm it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I did. So this should be substantial. So probably most of you don't know that Max Planck, who was the beginner of this guy who started quantum theory, was obsessed with Leibniz. Okay, well, there's a whole history with it. Initially, he thought he was obsessed with Maupertuis, and then people said, no, Maupertuis isn't the key guy, it's Leibniz. But why would, now, what I want to just point out is, why would that be? Okay, for the first thing was the idea of action. Okay, so what Planck realized was the concept of action in quantum theory was in fact an earlier concept that he saw in Maupertuis, principle of least action, and then he traces it back to Leibniz, and he goes on. So reality for quantum theory in Planck's world is the quantum of action. Okay, it's the action itself. Now, what is action? Wait a minute. What's not substantial in this sense are particles and waves. It's not that there aren't, let me put it this way, it's not that there aren't particles, it's not that there aren't waves, but they're not substantial. They're not eternal realities. They come and go, they transform, they do different things. So the things that he's seen in quantum theory, particles and waves, and particle-related phenomena and wave-related phenomena are all, if you like, derivative or secondary from this one reality, which is action, okay? Now, in the action, what is the action? Action for him is the same as it is for Maupertuis and Leibniz, I think, and it goes up to, in my tracking, it goes up into Lazare-Carnot, and it's very much the acting in the world. I mean, it's an action, it's the thing that an agent does. So if you say, well, reality is ultimately action, it's ultimately, you know, like agency all the way down. It's not what the mechanical guys would interpret action as. So, I mean, I don't know if this illuminates any of those who are here that are more looking at Leibniz from the point of the physics and the mathematics, but I think it's a very strong connection, and I think it maybe illuminates some of these issues as to what is substance and what are things that we observe and so forth. You can't observe a quantum of action. You can observe a particle and a wave, and they have quantum aspects to them, but the reality is always a quantum of action. Okay, enough. Anybody want to comment on that? Dan, what do you think?
Right.
Well, I could say something on that if you want. Yeah, I think that may I say something?
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think modern physicists, maybe with Planck, with the exception of Planck, have very much underestimated Leibniz's contributions to physics. And he doesn't just introduce action; he gives a very studied and a very persuasive account of why it's a necessary quantity in physics for seeing what happens through time. And of course, he gets the dimensions of action right, and he gets the dimension of energy right in terms of ability to do work. So I think that Leibniz's contributions to modern physics are actually much underappreciated, and a lot of this is ascribed to later thinkers from even the 19th century. Whereas I think Leibniz is pretty clear. I mean, there are, you know, there are some wrinkles to the concept of action, and there are many things to be said about it, and there are some features of what he says about it that don't stand the test of time. But the essential idea of action as an important physical quantity, I think, is right on the money.
I agree. Thank you.
Right. So, well, I have some connectivity problem, but I suspect that now you can hear me. Let me introduce Daniel. question as the last question, because we are kind of 5 minutes to the end. So if you can keep it short.
Sure. This is just concerns the nature of the evidence from microscopes for the infinite complexity in bodies. So it appears from the examples, well, the microscopists find complicated things that are small, and they find parts of those that are complicated things smaller than them, but they don't at any point, of course, go find infinitely complexity among those things. But Leibniz seems to suggest that there is such an infinite complexity, and he has an argument for this. I mean, he has arguments for this from mathematics. Does he seem to think that the evidence of the microscopes goes all the way to justify the conclusion about the implicit complexity of the material things, or does he seem to, in these contexts to bring in premises that will, along with the empirical evidence, go to suggest that implicit complexity?
Okay, can I answer? Yeah, can you hear me? So thank you for your question. I had read it. I can answer by remarking that Leibniz is very, very confident and optimistic about the fact that microscopy is only just its beginning. It's a new observational tool which will for sure be improved and should be improved in the future. And if so Leibniz and we in the 17th century can reach only a certain level of complexity in the bodies, in the future we sure will get deeper and deeper in the complexity of bodies. Obviously, we cannot reach the ultimate element of things, because the ultimate element of things are immaterial. For instance, there is an exchange of letters with Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnerhaus, to which I have made hint during my presentation, which is in the year, which of course in the years around 93, 94. You can find, if I remember, in the third series, if I'm not wrong, of the Academy edition, and in the discussion is just about this topic, the prospects of the improvement of optics and microscopy in general, but also telescopes, so far away the stars and the tiny texture of matter. And I believe that Leibniz's attitude is something like this: what we have already deduced a priori, will find a confirmation by empirical observation thanks to the technological progress. So that's what I would say.
Right. So we have 1 more minute, and Ohad, if you can make a comment such that it's not longer than 35 seconds, go ahead.
Yeah, just to this point, I think Leibniz was not at all naive about having any hope whatsoever that, you know, the microscope, however advanced, would get us to infinity. So I think we should not think about, you know, the potential discoveries of the microscope as sort of motivating Leibniz, and also, yeah, confirming in some sense. But I think his whole conception of infinity is really related to a notion of unity that is very important, completeness and unity of organic being. But I won't say more. in my 35 seconds here.
Alessandro, a last word on this, or are you happy?
So Oad agrees with Dan.
Yeah, not
Okay.
on everything, but on the point that what we're saying are corporeal substances.
Okay. Thank you for your remark.
Yeah, the monads, you know, we're seeing monads, the ego, I'm okay with that. And it also shows how.
Well, you don't see monad, but a rationalist has eyes also.
Okay.
He doesn't see only with the eyes of the mind. He has also eyes, hands, and so on.
Right.
That
On
will
this
say.
note note of at least partial agreement, let me bring this meeting to a close.
Thank you.
Thank all the speakers, and of course, thank all the participants, and see you all next week on a session on history of philosophy.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you for
Good night and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.